Charles Goodyear was a Connecticut inventor and a persistent dreamer who became one of the most important figures in the history of industrial innovation. Charles Goodyear, inventor and entrepreneur, was born in New Haven, Connecticut on December 29, 1800. He came from a family of modest means but strong work ethic. He had a determined spirit that would define his entire life. Goodyear's early years were marked by curiosity and mechanical aptitude. He did not receive extensive formal education, instead learning through practical experience in his father's hardware business. His education in the workshop shaped his understanding of materials and manufacturing, though his later career would test his persistence in ways few could imagine. After working in his father's business, Goodyear moved to Philadelphia in 1826, where he established a hardware store with his father. The store specialized in selling domestic hardware products and agricultural implements. Goodyear was ambitious and believed in the potential of American manufacturing to compete with European imports. However, despite his enthusiasm and hard work, the business side of the enterprise proved challenging. Goodyear was a better inventor than businessman. He struggled with credit, inventory management, and the economic instabilities of the era. By 1830, his business had failed, leaving him deeply in debt. The failure was devastating both financially and personally. Goodyear had invested everything into this venture and its collapse left him bankrupt. He was imprisoned for debt multiple times, a common practice in that era. This period of his life taught him resilience and determination, qualities that would serve him throughout his later obsessive pursuit of rubber innovation. It was during this difficult period that Goodyear became interested in rubber. In 1834, he encountered a life preserver made of India rubber at a store in New York. The product was poorly made and Goodyear believed he could improve it. This chance encounter would change the course of his life and eventually revolutionize industry worldwide. At the time, rubber was known but essentially useless for most practical applications. Natural rubber, derived from the sap of tropical trees, had remarkable properties. It was waterproof and elastic. However, it also had crippling defects. In hot weather, rubber became sticky and melted. In cold weather, it became brittle and cracked. Items made from rubber quickly deteriorated and emitted foul odors. The rubber industry had experienced a brief boom in the 1830s, with companies manufacturing rubber shoes, coats, and other products. But the boom quickly turned to bust when consumers discovered that their rubber goods became unusable with changes in temperature. Warehouses full of rubber products turned into masses of putrid, sticky waste. Investors lost fortunes. The rubber industry was considered dead by the mid-1830s. Goodyear, however, saw opportunity where others saw failure. He became convinced that rubber could be made stable and useful if only the right treatment could be discovered. He began experimenting with rubber in 1834, despite having no scientific training and no financial resources. His family thought he was mad to pursue such a discredited material. His wife and children suffered poverty and deprivation as Goodyear poured what little money he had into his experiments. He mixed rubber with every substance he could think of. He tried magnesia, quicklime, and various acids. He boiled rubber, baked it, exposed it to sunlight, and treated it with chemicals. Most of his experiments failed completely. Some showed temporary promise only to fail when tested under different conditions. Goodyear's obsession with rubber consumed his life. He was imprisoned for debt repeatedly during this period, and he conducted experiments even in his jail cells. His family moved from place to place, always one step ahead of creditors. They lived in poverty, sometimes going hungry, while Goodyear spent their last pennies on rubber and chemicals for his experiments. In 1837, Goodyear discovered that treating rubber with nitric acid seemed to improve its properties. He called this process and received some financial backing to manufacture mailbags for the government using his treated rubber. For a brief moment, it seemed his persistence might pay off. However, the acid treatment proved inadequate. The mailbags failed when exposed to summer heat. Goodyear's backers abandoned him. He was back where he started, penniless and discredited, but still convinced that rubber could be tamed. He continued his experiments with manic intensity. His family's suffering deepened. His wife, Clarissa remained loyal despite the hardships, though she must have questioned her husband's sanity. Their children wore clothes made from rubber fabric that Goodyear created, marking them as objects of ridicule in their community. In 1838, Goodyear met Nathaniel Hayward, who had been experimenting with mixing sulfur with rubber. Hayward had discovered that sulfur seemed to eliminate the stickiness of rubber and reduce its odor. Goodyear purchased Hayward's process and hired him as an assistant. He began experimenting with sulfur treatments, mixing sulfur with rubber in various proportions and subjecting the mixture to different conditions. The sulfur helped, but it did not solve the fundamental problem. Rubber treated with sulfur still became sticky in heat and brittle in cold. Goodyear continued his experiments, trying endless variations of temperature, sulfur content, and treatment methods. He was working largely by trial and error, with no theoretical framework to guide him. The breakthrough came in the winter of 1839, though the exact circumstances have become the stuff of legend. According to the most popular account, Goodyear accidentally dropped a piece of sulfur-treated rubber onto a hot stove. When he examined the rubber, he found that instead of melting, it had charred like leather. More importantly, the area around the charred spot had been transformed. It remained flexible and elastic but was no longer sticky or brittle. It had become stable. Whether this discovery was truly accidental or the result of systematic experimentation remains debated by historians. Goodyear himself gave different accounts at different times. What is certain is that by early 1839, Goodyear had discovered that heating sulfur-treated rubber transformed its properties fundamentally. He called this process vulcanization, after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire. However, discovering the principle of vulcanization was only the beginning of Goodyear's struggles. He needed to perfect the process, determining the exact proportions of sulfur and the precise temperature and duration of heating required. He needed to prove that vulcanized rubber would remain stable under all conditions. And he needed to secure patents and find investors to commercialize his discovery. All of this required money that Goodyear did not have. For the next several years, Goodyear continued to live in poverty while perfecting his process. He obtained samples of vulcanized rubber and exposed them to extreme heat and cold to test their stability. He experimented with different additives to improve the properties of vulcanized rubber. He tried adding white lead to create colored rubber products. He worked obsessively, neglecting his health and his family's welfare in pursuit of perfection. In 1841, Goodyear finally felt confident enough in his process to seek a patent. However, he lacked the money to file for patent protection. He approached potential investors and manufacturers, trying to interest them in vulcanized rubber. Most dismissed him as a crank who had wasted years on a discredited material. A few were interested enough to examine his samples, but none were willing to invest significant capital. Goodyear's financial situation became desperate. His family was evicted from their home. His children suffered from malnutrition and inadequate clothing. One of his children died during this period, a tragedy that Goodyear blamed on the poverty caused by his rubber obsession. Yet even this did not deter him from his quest. In 1842, Goodyear finally obtained his first investors and established a small factory in Springfield, Massachusetts to manufacture vulcanized rubber products. He also applied for a patent on his vulcanization process. However, his troubles were far from over. His factory struggled with production problems. The vulcanization process was difficult to control precisely, and many batches of rubber were ruined. Quality was inconsistent. Customers were skeptical of rubber products given the industry's previous failures. Meanwhile, Goodyear learned that other inventors were working on similar processes. In England, Thomas Hancock had been experimenting with heating sulfur and rubber. Hancock obtained British patents for vulcanization in 1843, before Goodyear could secure his own British patent. Goodyear was convinced that Hancock had stolen his process by examining samples of vulcanized rubber that Goodyear had sent to England. In 1844, Goodyear finally received his United States patent for vulcanization. The patent gave him legal protection for his process in America, but it also made him a target. Other manufacturers who had been producing rubber goods claimed that they had discovered vulcanization independently or that Goodyear's patent was invalid. A series of patent infringement lawsuits followed that would consume much of Goodyear's remaining life. The most significant case was heard in Trenton, New Jersey in 1852. Goodyear was represented by Daniel Webster, one of the most famous lawyers in America. Webster delivered a lengthy defense of Goodyear's patent, arguing that Goodyear alone had discovered the true process of vulcanization through years of persistent experimentation. The court ruled in Goodyear's favor, upholding his patent. However, the victory was incomplete. Patent infringement continued, and Goodyear lacked the resources to pursue every violator. Despite holding the patent for vulcanization, Goodyear never achieved financial success. He was a poor businessman who licensed his patent too freely and for inadequate compensation. He trusted people who cheated him. He invested in manufacturing ventures that failed. He spent lavishly on promoting vulcanized rubber, creating elaborate displays for exhibitions and world's fairs. In 1851, Goodyear created a spectacular exhibit at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London. He displayed a vast array of vulcanized rubber products, from furniture to jewelry to artwork. The exhibit cost him $30,000, an enormous sum that he borrowed and could never repay. The exhibit won him medals and recognition, but no profits. In 1855, Goodyear created an even more elaborate exhibit for the Paris Exposition. He constructed an entire room made of vulcanized rubber, with rubber walls, floors, furniture, and decorations. The exhibit was a sensation and earned Goodyear the Cross of the Legion of Honor from Emperor Napoleon III. However, the exhibit also cost him $50,000 and drove him deeper into debt. While in Paris for the exposition, Goodyear was imprisoned for debt by French creditors. He spent several weeks in a French debtor's prison, still promoting vulcanized rubber from his cell. This incident captured the paradox of Goodyear's life. He had invented a process that was creating fortunes for others and revolutionizing industry, yet he himself remained impoverished and imprisoned. By the late 1850s, vulcanized rubber had become an essential industrial material. It was used in machinery belts, hoses, gaskets, and countless other applications. The rubber industry that had collapsed in the 1830s was reborn and growing rapidly. Rubber shoes and boots became common consumer products. Rubber was used in telegraph insulation, enabling the expansion of communications networks. The value of goods manufactured with vulcanized rubber ran into millions of dollars annually. Yet Goodyear saw little of this wealth. His patents were expiring, and he had already licensed away most of his rights for inadequate payments. He continued to be pursued by creditors and spent his final years in poor health and financial distress. Goodyear's personal life was marked by tragedy and hardship. His wife Clarissa bore him 9 children, but only 6 survived to adulthood. The family's poverty contributed to the deaths of several of his children. Clarissa herself endured decades of deprivation and uncertainty, moving constantly to avoid creditors, never knowing if her husband's obsession would finally pay off. Despite everything, she remained loyal to Goodyear until her death in 1853. After Clarissa's death, Goodyear married Fanny Wardell in 1854. His second marriage provided some companionship in his final years, but it could not relieve his financial burdens or restore his failing health. Throughout his life, Goodyear suffered from poor health, likely worsened by his poverty and by exposure to the chemicals he used in his experiments. He experienced frequent bouts of illness and was often too weak to work. In his final years, his health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from what was described as gout and other ailments. On July 1, 1860, Charles Goodyear died in New York City while traveling to see his dying daughter. He was 59 years old. At the time of his death, Goodyear was $200,000 in debt. His funeral expenses were paid by a friend, as his estate had no funds. He was buried in Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut, not far from where he had been born 6 decades earlier. In death, as in life, Goodyear was remembered with a mixture of admiration and pity. His legacy is one of perseverance in the face of overwhelming obstacles. He was a man who believed in his vision with absolute conviction and pursued it despite poverty, ridicule, and repeated failure. He sacrificed everything, his health, his family's welfare, his financial security, for his obsession with rubber. His discovery of vulcanization transformed industry and improved countless lives, yet he died in debt, never enjoying the fruits of his invention. The irony of Goodyear's life is profound. He created a process that made others wealthy while he remained poor. The companies that manufactured vulcanized rubber products prospered while Goodyear struggled. His patent, which should have guaranteed him fortune, instead brought him lawsuits and expenses he could not afford. He was honored with medals and awards from governments and scientific societies, but these honors could not pay his debts or feed his family. Modern historians have debated whether Goodyear was a tragic hero or a foolish obsessive. Some see him as a martyr to invention, a man who sacrificed himself for progress. Others view him as an impractical dreamer who neglected his responsibilities to his family in pursuit of an obsession. Some argue that his business failures were as much a part of his story as his technical success, and that his inability to profit from his invention reveals important truths about innovation and capitalism. What is undeniable is that Goodyear's discovery changed the world. Vulcanized rubber became one of the essential materials of the industrial age. It enabled the development of automobiles, with rubber tires making modern transportation possible. It was used in countless industrial applications, from gaskets to hoses to conveyor belts. It became a strategic material in wartime, essential for military vehicles and equipment. The rubber industry that Goodyear's process created employed millions of people worldwide and generated billions of dollars in economic value. In 1898, nearly 40 years after Goodyear's death, Frank Siebling founded a tire company in Akron, Ohio, and named it the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in honor of Charles Goodyear. The company became one of the largest tire manufacturers in the world. However, the Goodyear family received no financial benefit from the use of Charles Goodyear's name. The company was not connected to Goodyear's heirs and paid no royalties for the use of his name. This seems fitting in a melancholy way. Even in death, Goodyear's name created value for others while his descendants received nothing. Goodyear's story raises profound questions about the nature of innovation and the relationship between inventors and the commercial exploitation of their inventions. He was a brilliant experimenter who made a world-changing discovery, yet he lacked the business acumen to profit from it. He was generous in licensing his patents, trusting in the goodness of others, and was repeatedly cheated. He spent lavishly on promotion and exhibitions, believing that demonstrating the value of vulcanized rubber would bring him success, but these expenditures only deepened his debt. Some have argued that the patent system failed Goodyear, that it did not provide adequate protection or compensation for his invention. Others contend that Goodyear failed himself through poor business decisions and impractical idealism. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Charles Goodyear comes from recognizing both his genius and his limitations. He was a man of extraordinary persistence and vision who discovered a process that transformed industry. He was also a man who sacrificed his family's welfare for his obsession and who lacked the practical skills to benefit from his own invention. His life was marked by suffering that might have been avoided with better judgment or more concern for his family's immediate needs. Yet without his obsessive persistence, vulcanization might not have been discovered for years or decades. Progress sometimes requires obsessives like Goodyear, people who will pursue an idea despite all rational reasons to quit. Goodyear represents a particular type of inventor, the self-taught experimenter who works through trial and error rather than scientific theory. He had no formal training in chemistry or materials science. He did not understand the molecular changes that occurred during vulcanization. He simply tried thousands of experiments until he found what worked. This approach was inefficient and costly, but it succeeded where more systematic approaches might have failed. His story reminds us that innovation does not always follow predictable paths and that important discoveries sometimes come from unlikely sources. In the end, Charles Goodyear was neither a perfect hero nor a tragic fool, but rather a complex figure whose strengths and weaknesses were inseparably intertwined. His perseverance was admirable but also destructive. His vision was brilliant but also blinding. He achieved a discovery of immense importance but at a terrible personal cost. He is remembered today primarily for the company that bears his name and for the ubiquity of vulcanized rubber in modern life, which is perhaps unfair to a man whose actual life was far more complicated and painful than these simple associations suggest. Goodyear was, even in death, a man of contradictions, remembered for creating an industry that made others wealthy while he died in poverty, honored for a discovery whose benefits he never enjoyed.